Same time, we have had a slate of hearings that happened yesterday, confirmation hearings for incoming officials in the Trump administration. The most high-profile person yesterday was Senator Marco Rubio, up for Secretary of State. Had a couple of interesting remarks. The most important for our purposes is really going to be about future policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. Here's what he had to say.
Let me first echo the president's words and what he said in an interview about a year ago. He was asked about the war in Ukraine. He says, I want the dying to stop. I want people to stop dying. I want the killing to stop. And frankly, I don't know how anyone could say they don't. The destruction that Ukraine is undergoing is extraordinary. It's going to take a generation to rebuild it. Millions of Ukrainians no longer live in Ukraine. And the disruption, that means how many of them are going to come back and what are they going to come back to? Even as I speak to you now, the Ukrainian infrastructure and their energy infrastructure is being decimated in ways that are going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild over the next decades. So this is an important conflict, and I think it should be the official position of the United States that this war should be brought to an end. And I think it should be the official policy of the United States that we want to see it end. Now, what that master plan looks like it's going to be hard work. This is not going to be an easy endeavor. But it's going to require bold diplomacy. And my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire. And we're going to have, in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic. There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukrainians, and the United States lend itself there. It's also important that there be some balance on both sides. In essence, it will be difficult to achieve this objective of a ceasefire and ultimately a peace settlement unless both sides have leverage.
A couple of very interesting things that happened there. Number one is saying that, echoing Donald Trump's phrase, we need to stop the dying. But actually, so I watched the entire hearing. The most important part was, he says, unrealistic to believe that Ukraine can ever push Russia back to pre-February 2022 invasion lines. Quote, there will also need to be concessions made by the Russian Federation and by the Ukrainians. He brought up later on, Krystal, the use of Russian sanctions as a leverage tool from the United States, effectively saying, listen, you guys pull out this way, we take off these sanctions. I don't know how powerful that will be. The Russians have figured out a lot of ways around these sanctions. Turns out they don't actually work that well. Shocker. Yeah. But I was very interested to say, I mean, this is effectively a declaration of policy here now from the incoming administration that this idea of nothing without Ukraine, he even said nothing without Ukraine, whatever long it takes, not going to happen. He's like, that era is over. But two, the mere acknowledgement of the incoming Secretary of State to say the pre-February 2022 is not going to happen, that is a radical change in US policy. I know that it was assumed and all this, nobody really knew for sure, but I mean, that is as close as you can get to an actual statement from the incoming White House. And in Kyiv, they must be, I mean, they're probably freaking out, especially what happened after, they're used to the Biden people just being like, okay, you can shoot into Russia, but only 200 yards. And then the next month, be like, now 300 yards. But,
all right, well,
right.
Let's do whatever.
Okay, all right, sure. We'll just do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, this is a whole other, this is a whole new thing. So arguably the most important thing that came out of that hearing, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump says he's going to get us the deal on day one, so we've
That's
only
right.
got a few more days of
He's got 4 days.
This war.
Listen, Steve Witkoff, get your ass on a plane to Moscow. He is our new Avril Harriman, who was this rich banker. He was the FDR's ambassador to Moscow during World War II. He was an excellent diplomat, by the way. So, yes, listen, Steve, get over there, man. We need you.
I mean, part of what you say, though, does underscore the difficulty at this point of trying to bring this war to some sort of conclusion because while with Israel, we have all the leverage in the world, just requires the willpower to actually use it. With Russia, we don't have as much. I mean,
but with Ukraine, we've got total.
With Ukraine, we do, but you have to get the Russians to come to the table as well. So it is a tricky situation. And you know, Rubio constitutionally, like he is a hawk, and especially with regards to anywhere in Latin America, which we'll get to in just a moment. But you know, I think there's almost a beltway-wide recognition, whether they want to admit it or not, that like what Rubio said is just obviously manifestly true. They're not going to be able to retake all of the. I mean, they were talking about Pelosi saying, or we're 100% going to get back Crimea. That's not happening.
It's crazy.
That's not happening. So it's nice to hear at least a little bit of realism here from Rubio. We'll see how it actually plays out in practice and the means that Trump uses. He's a wild card in order to try to secure some sort of an end to the conflict if he decides to go in that direction. It was interesting. You know, it's so interesting watching Washington work. Like, Rubio is basically, I mean, he is effectively a neocon. He's a hawkish guy. There's always has been, right? That is his ideological direction. The fact that he gets put in as Secretary of State is really antithetical to the idea that the Trump administration is going to be oriented in this anti-war kind of a way. And so you would think, like if it was you or I questioning, it would be contentious. But because Rubio is one of them, it's relatively like, you know, it's very cordial. The Washington Post endorsed him.
Yeah,
like,
right.
you know, they're like, oh, he's one of us. He can, yeah, he passes their respectability threshold. So it's a much different approach to him. I did think there was an interesting line of questioning taken by Senator Chris Murphy. He's emerged as a kind of an interesting voice here in the emerging second Trump term, where he really pressed Rubio on Trump's corruption and the fact that, and this is a very important line of argument, Trump has these business deals all around the world, but in particular, he has massive, and Kushner have massive financial interests in the Middle East and with the Gulf Arab states. Trump, we don't even know how much money he's getting from this freaking Saudi Live Gulf tour. They're going to have another event at one of his properties. That's just one example. Kushner got, $2 billion from the Saudis. There are all kinds of financial entanglements there. And, you know, when you've got a president who the largest sphere of influence that a president has is in terms of foreign policy, you have to ask the question, how are these financial entanglements impacting their views and their approach to foreign policy? Is this just about American interests, or is this about your business interests as well? Chris Murphy made this point and pressed Senator Rubio on exactly this direction. Let's take a listen to a little bit of that.
Over the last 8 years, while he was in office and since he's been out of office, he and his family have become more deeply dependent on revenue from governments in the Middle East. During his last presidency, Middle East interests sent about $10 million to Trump properties. After he left office, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who was his primary Middle East envoy, was handed $2 billion in investment by the Saudis, even though a Saudi investment board said the investment was a bad business decision. That investment actually comes up for renewal in 2026, giving the Saudis massive leverage over the Trump family. And then to make matters worse, right after the election, the Trump organization said that in this term, the president-elect's second term, it would drop its previous prohibition on doing new deals in the Middle East with private foreign companies aligned with foreign governments. So the Trump organization is going to be signing new business deals in the Middle East with private companies that have connections to foreign governments at the very moment that you are going to be conducting sensitive diplomacy in these countries. That's just extraordinary. Never before in the history of this country has a president been, literally receiving cash from foreign governments and from foreign companies that are backed by foreign governments in the middle of their term. If you or I had done this as senators, we would be in violent violation of Senate ethics rule. Do you have an issue, or will you raise an issue with the president about his growing financial connection with the governments that you're going to be negotiating with?
Well, first of all, I am not neither authorized nor in any position to give you sort of any insights into any of these arrangements you've pointed out. You know, you mentioned Jared Kushner as an example. He's a private citizen, happens to be a Floridian. I don't know what, if any, engagement he has in the work that's going on now. I can tell you what I know. Obviously, I'm not in the State Department yet, but I can tell you as an example, the president's envoy to that region, who was charged, Steve Witkoff, who was charged with being an envoy towards reaching an accommodation between the Israelis and the Saudis, has been working cooperatively and together with the Biden administration. And in fact, I dare to say that all involved deserve credit for the ceasefire that the chairman's just announced. But Steve Witkoff's been a critical component of it, and he has been involved in it from day one. I think the broader consideration about whether we want to see a Saudi-Israeli mutual recognition and relationship would be one of the most historic developments in the history of the region. And they have a right to be in the business. I mean, that's the business that they're in. They're in the real estate business. They've been for a very long time, both domestically and abroad. They have properties in multiple countries. So at the end of the day, I don't know, his family is entitled to continue to operate their business. The fundamental question is not whether his family is involved in business. The fundamental question is whether that is in any way impacting the conduct of our foreign policy in a way that's counter to our national interest. And the president's made abundantly clear that every decision he makes and every decision we are to make at the State Department should be driven by whether or not it serves the core national interests of the United States.
So in any case, you're not going to get much out of Rubio on it there. But I think that's a very important question because we're a long way from Jimmy Carter selling his peanut farm in order to avoid any conflicts of interest. In fact, not only with regard to foreign government entanglements, but I mean, everybody knows the way to Donald Trump's heart is through his pocketbook. So they've been showering him with like insane amounts of money, even after he wins re-election, into his campaign coffers. He can't even run again. And yet all this money, hundreds of millions of dollars flowing into his campaign coffers, you know, Zuckerberg and Sam Altman and all these people sucking up to him with $1 million contributions into the inauguration fund. And then obviously, you know, the Gulf Arab states in particular, they were early movers in this direction. I mean, the thing to Jared Kushner was just a flat out bribe. We know that MBS intervened in that decision to fund him to that regard. He had been rejected by the larger council, and MBS came in over the top and was like, no, we're gonna make this one happen for him. So very legitimate line of questioning. Obviously, you don't get anything useful out of Rubio there. The other thing that was just worth a mention that Glenn Greenwald pointed out is New York Times hawks, in particular Brett Stevens, already making their move with Rubio lined up here to be Secretary of State, and he is almost certainly going to get confirmed by, I think, a large margin. I think a lot of Democrats will vote for him.
Even like Tim Kaine's voting for him.
Yeah, I think a lot of Democrats are going to vote for him as well. But New York Times publishing an op-ed literally calling for military intervention into Venezuela to take out Maduro. We can put this up on the screen. This is B3. Donald Trump has set some grandiose foreign policy goals for a second term. They say, here's one goal that's overdue, morally right, and international security interests, deposing the regime of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela through coercive diplomacy, if possible, or force if necessary. And he lays out the case for why we should be willing to wage a regime change war in Venezuela, something that certainly Marco Rubio would be, if anyone, it would be open to such a thing, it would be Marco Rubio.
Well, the only thing I can say is at least we have seen Donald Trump has been able to exert some influence. Rubio was singing a real different tune on Ukraine, and at least these guys know that it's not up to them in public. Behind the scenes, I have no idea. In fact, Latin America is one of the very things I warned about because the problem is that you can only do that for stuff that you really care a lot about. But when you have somebody like that, Secretary of State in power, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And I've talked about this extensively, that you have no power, that you have no interest in, right? Back burner, relationship, Venezuela, whatever, who cares? So that means that's kind of default up to the Secretary of State. Now, what policy is he gonna pursue? Don't forget, you know, John Bolton and all that in the past always advocated for regime change in Venezuela. So we're all gonna keep our eyes on that one, and I genuinely think that is the biggest danger area.
Yeah, and there's
Trump.
a significant constituency in favor of a bunch of these psychos.
All right, let's go to the next one. This was Pam Bondi. She's gonna be is up for Attorney General. Probably going to get through. Yeah. It looks pretty likely. She was pressed about election certification in 2020 and some of those cases. Let's take a listen.
That central to the peaceful transition of power in a democracy is the acceptance of the results of an election. To my knowledge, Donald Trump has never acknowledged the legal results of the 2020 election. Are you prepared to say today under oath without reservation that Donald Trump lost the presidential contest to Joe Biden in 2020?
Ranking Member Durbin, President Biden is the President of the United States. He was duly sworn in, and he is the President of the United States. There was a peaceful transition of power. President Trump left office and was overwhelmingly elected in 2024.
So, yeah, typical, but I mean, listen, I guess he won now, so it doesn't really matter anymore. Let's put this one up there on the screen as well, because we wanted to keep you guys updated. Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation hearing is probably the diciest one currently, just in terms of the number of votes, and also it has not yet been scheduled, which people are very interested in, shall we say.
Yeah.
They are blaming it on procedural paperwork issues. But here the the Wall Street Journal reports, quote, some Senate Republicans have left recent meetings with former Representative Tulsi Gabbard with reservations about her qualifications. Those concerns have largely remained private, and GOP lawmakers are expected to publicly support her despite that. But further missteps could jeopardize her nomination. In her meeting with Senator James Lankford, Gabbard couldn't clearly articulate what the role of the DNI entails. according to 2 of her Republican aides and 2 transition officials. When she met with Senator Mike Rounds, she seemed confused about a key U.S. national security surveillance power. That's the top legislative priority for nearly every member. I'm assuming we're talking about 702 there. Keep in mind, these are anonymous leaks. I don't know. They probably want to nuke her, and so they're sending this to the Journal. The point, though, is that this is the first one I have seen where they said there were multiple people behind the scenes who were very, very skeptical of her. Senator Susan Collins, for example, has told reporters that she's going to wait for the background check before making any decisions, so they're not outright coming out and saying that they would vote for her. Senator John Curtis of Utah said he, quote, needs more information. That was just on Tuesday, so it was a couple days ago, before he can decide to vote for her. So there are multiple people, it seems, behind the scenes who are weary, and absent direct intervention from Trump, let's say there's one thing they can hang their hat on, then she's only 1 vote away from getting voted down. So she right now actually seems to be in a way more precarious position than even RFK Jr.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, you have to think about both the personal and the ideological, right? The Democrats hate her because she's a turncoat.
Right, exactly.
She cannot count
She will not get a
on-
single vote.
She cannot count on any support from the Democratic caucus. You may have 1 or 2, who knows, but she cannot count on any support from the Democratic caucus because she's a turncoat. They don't want to support her. The Republicans, you have a lot of ideological concern because of things she said in the past. Now, she's proven herself willing to bend with the wind and, flip completely her position on Section 702, whatever. But they don't trust her, right? And she doesn't have she wasn't in the Senate, so she doesn't have a relationship with these people. And I'm just going to be honest with you, when you're around Tulsi Gabbard, she comes off kind of odd. She's a hard person to really immediately click with. So the Republicans are not sure about this one. Now, I think they'll probably all end up voting for her. Donald Trump wants her. Donald Trump is likely to get her. But if there was any other shoe to drop with her and they had an excuse to not vote for her, I think that there are a number of them who would take that excuse to not vote for her.
Yeah.
And the margin is very narrow. Republicans control 53 seats in the Senate, so she only has a few that she could lose, assuming that she gets absolutely no Democratic support. So hers is definitely the most on the rocks. Again, I expect that the most likely outcome is she also gets through, but this leak to the Wall Street Journal is, a little bit of a test balloon, I feel to the Trump people of well, if we didn't vote for this one, how mad would you be at us, effectively?
Yeah, exactly. So let's all watch it. It's very possible that it may not happen. The hearings, we've only got 4 days till Donald Trump is going to take office. They're going to continue a little bit after that. But John Ratcliffe appears to be able to go through quite easily for CIA director. But as of things where they stand right now, Kristi Noem and Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. do not have hearings currently scheduled before the committees, which itself is kind of a problem just because the longer this drags out, the more juice and energy that may be able to have. That said, probably more likely than not she gets confirmed, but she's the one who I only have at the 55 percentile as opposed to the rest where I have in the 60s and plus, absent something pretty crazy would happen. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.